Tezayin Abed Aleph. The Gemara had asked a question yesterday because we seem to have two different opinions. One is in Maseches Tamid, and the other one is in Maseches Midos. And it seems to be a stira, seems to be a contradiction. What was the contradiction? It has to do with a chamber called the sheep chamber, where they would store sheep for the various karbanos involving sheep. And the Mishnah in Maseches Tamid tells us that this chamber was positioned in the Mikzoat Tzfonis Ma'aravis. It was in the northwest corner of the Beis Hamokad, which was an atrium which was off on the north side of the temple, the temple courtyard. It was an atrium partially inside the temple, protruding into the temple, and partially protruding outside the temple. And the Mishnah in Maseches Tamid says that there were 4 chambers that opened up into this atrium. Thank you so much. And the sheep chamber was on the northwest chamber, okay, that opened up into this atrium. So that's one opinion. Then we saw another opinion in Maseches Midos, which says that it was not in the northwest chamber, but rather it was in the southwest chamber. So we seem to have a contradiction. How do we reconcile the contradiction? Amar Rav Huna, this is where we're up to on line 5. Amar Rav Huna, Man Tana Midos, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakovi. It's very simple. It's a different Tana. And now, so say it's a machlokas tanoim, which is fine. It's a machlokas tanoim. But not only is it a machlokas tanoim, but we're identifying the name of the Tana who is the general author of Maseches Midos. And his name is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And now we're going to set out to prove that the author of Maseches Midos is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and not somebody else. And that's the whole purpose of the following exercise, okay? Ditnan. Ezras Nashim Haisa Orech Meya Ushloshim V'chamesh Al Rochav Meya Ushloshim V'chamesh. Now, it's a good idea, if you have one, to have a diagram of the temple, an aerial photo, an aerial diagram of the temple in front of you. If you have it in your head, great. And if not, it's good to have a diagram either from the art scroll or from some other source. I'm sure you can find an aerial photo online as well. And basically, you have something called the outer courtyard, or the Ezras Nashim, the ladies' courtyard. It was the first thing that you walked into when you came into the temple from the eastern entrance. Okay, you came in from the east. The first courtyard that you came into was called the Ezras Nashim, and its dimensions, according to Maseches Midos, are 135 amos by 135 amos. The Arba Lishkos Hayu Bedalid Mikza Oseha, and there were 4 chambers in the 4 corners of this courtyard. Now, don't confuse this with our previous discussion of the Beis Hamokad. That's a completely separate atrium. It's a completely different area. Here we're talking about the women's courtyard, which is the first large courtyard that you would come into when you came into the temple. There are 4 chambers. In each corner there's a different chamber. And what we're going to see is that we're going to be working in a counterclockwise direction, starting from the chamber that you encounter when you first walk in on your left. We're going to start there, and then we're going to go in a counterclockwise direction. Umahayu mishamshos, so dromis mizrachis hihaisa lishkas hanizirim. So the first chamber we're going to look at is the one that you come in immediately on your left, is in the southeast corner, is the lishkas hanizirim, is the nazir chamber. And shesham nazirim mevashlim eshalmeim umegalchin saran umeshalchin tachas adud. This is a place where the nazir would bring his karbanos at the end of his Nazirite period. He would bring his carbon shlamim, that was part of it was brought on the mizbeach. He would bring the rest of the animal into this chamber, cook it in a big pot, prepare it to eat it, and he would cut off his hair there, throw his hair into the fire to fuel the cooking, and that was what it was called. Mizrachis Tzifonis. Now let's go to my right now. Hi haisa lishkas ha'etzim. was called the wood chamber, and Shesham Kohanim Bali Mumen Omdu Mumatlian Be'etzim Shekol Eitz Sheyesh Bo Tolas Posel Lagabi Mizbeach. This was where Kohanim who were blemished and could not do any other avoda, they would assign them to that chamber, and their job would be to examine the wood to make sure there were no worms, because any wood that had worms in it could not be used on the Mizbeach. Now, if you'll recall from Maseches Shkalim, and we're going to see this again in Maseches YOMA, that this is the chamber of the famous story where a Kohen once noticed that one of the floorboards was uneven, and he went to look, and of course we know that according to one version in the Gemara, the ark was buried up in the first temple, was buried underneath the floorboards in this lishka, and he went to take a look, and lightning came, or fire came, and incinerated him so as to prevent him from discovering what was underneath there. But that happened in this lishka sa'itzim, in this place, okay? Okay. Next, we go on to Tzonis Maravis, the northwest chamber. So you're now moving forward again in a counterclockwise direction. Hi haisa lishkas hamitzoraim. This was the chamber of the Mitzorah. The Mitzoraim would go there, I guess, to prepare for their sacrificial offering and for their purification. And Maravis Deromis, and finally the southwest corner, Amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Shoshachti Mahoisa Mishameshes. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, I forget what the function of that chamber was. Now, the very fact that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is being offered as the first Tana in this machlokas that we're going to see, says, I forget what it was used for. So we see that up until now, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's position has been the author. Because otherwise, why would we, if he wasn't writing this whole set of Mishnayos, why would we want to bring a Tana who doesn't remember what it was used for? It must be that he's been writing all of this up until now, and then he says, Rabbi Sai, I don't remember exactly what it was used for. And then we have another Tana who argues with everything, and he says, Abishol Omer Baha Yunostin Yain Vishemin V'Yaisan Nikros Lishkas Beishamanya. He says, I heard, and I have a Masorah what it was used for. It was used for storing of wine and oil, and it was called the Lishka of the House of Oil. But the point is, you see that the author of Maseches Midos is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That's the proof. Okay? So now we've identified the author of Maseches Midos, which is, again, to help us understand this, that there's a machlokus. When we see a machlokus between Maseches Tamid and Maseches Midos, it's because Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov wrote Maseches Midos, and another Tana, or a group of Tanoim, wrote Maseches Tamid. Hachanami Mistavra. The Gemara now says, this also makes sense based on another Mishnah. The Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he did nan. Let's look at another Mishnah. Kol hakesalim shahayu sham hayu gevohin chutz mikosel mizrachi. Now, in order to understand this, we have to, we're going to do a little bit more math now. In order to understand this, we have to appreciate that the preparation of the para aduma was done on Har Hazesim. And the Kohen, the Torah says that he has to be nochach Pesach ol Moed, that the Torah tells us that the Kohen who's preparing the paraduma has to be opposite the entrance of the Ohel Moed of the Heichal. So he's preparing the paraduma on Har HaZeisim, which is on the east side of the Temple Mount, but he has to be facing the Heichal and has to have a view of the inside of the Heichal. So there has to be no obstruction between where he's positioned and the entrance to the Heichal. And as we're going to see, the only way that you can do that is if he's going to be looking over the wall of the eastern side of the temple. And the reason why that's necessary is because the temple is on top of the Temple Mount, and it slopes. The Temple Mount slopes upwards from the east. As you go more west, it's on an incline. It's on an ascent. Okay? And not only that, but the temple itself is on an incline, going east to west, as we're going to see shortly. So if I'm positioned on a hillside that's adjacent to the Temple Mount, and I'm looking into, I want to be able to have a view of the entrance to the Heichal, the walls might obstruct my view. I can't be looking through the doorway of the temple because it's too low. and therefore the walls are going to be obstructing my view if it's on an ascent. So the Gemara is going to speak this all out to clarify the dimensions to be able to demonstrate that. So all of the walls of the temple were high, chutz mikosel mizrachi, except for the eastern wall. And the reason why the eastern wall could not be higher is shahakohen hasoreif es hapara omeid bahar hamishcha, because the Kohen who was preparing the paraduma, turning it into ashes, would stand on Har HaZeisim, umiskavein veroa keneged pischo shel heichal, and he had to be able to have a view of the heichal, of the entrance of the heichal, and b'shas hazoas adam, while he was sprinkling the blood. Utanan, and it says, kol hapisachim shahayu sham govan esrim ama v'rochven eser amos. All of the doorways of the temple were 20 amos high and 10 amos wide. Utnan lifnim mimenu soreg. So the Mishnah tells us that if each doorway was 20 amos high and 10 amos wide, on the eastern, if you're coming in from the eastern entrance of the temple, right after you came into the doors of the temple, you encounter something called a soreg, which was lattice work, which was a further type of barrier to bring you into the courtyard. Utnan lifnim mimenu hachel eser amos. And then right after you encounter this lattice work that you walk through, then you came into an area of 10 amos called the chel. And the chel was just a slope with stairs that went upwards into the Ezras Nashim, into the courtyard. Ushtemesrei malos hayusham rum maila chatzi ama v'shilcha chatzi ama. There were 12 steps. Each step was a half amma wide and a half amma high. So therefore, from the doorway of the temple to get to the Ezras Nashim, you had to walk up 12 steps. Okay, once you're in the temple, you got to walk up 12 steps, and then you're in the Ezras Nashim, you're in the outer courtyard. If each step is a half an amma height, so how high have you ascended? You've gone 6 ammas up. Okay, so now, if you were looking from a view straight into that doorway, the bottom 6 ammas are already obstructed. Okay, so we got 6 out of the 20 ammas of the doorway that are already obstructed. Tesvav milos olos mitocha hayordos me Ezras Yisrael Ezras Nashim rum maila chatzi amma v'shilcha chatzi amma. Now, to get from the Ezras Nashim to the Ezras Yisrael, there's an ascent. You're continuing to ascend. There are 15 steps to get from the Ezras Nashim to the inner courtyard, the Ezras Yisrael. And each one of those steps is also a half an amma wide and a half an amma height. And if that's the case, that's another 7.5 ammas of ascent. You're now up to 13.5 out of the 20 ammas which are now obstructed. If you're looking from an outside view from the temple entrance into, your view is going to be obstructed 13.5 ammas. Okay, out of the 20. So you've only got 6.5 ammas left. Okay, now utanan bein ha'ulam v'lam mizbeach chaf beis amma u'shteimasrei malos ha'yusham rum malachatzi amma v'shilcha chatzi amma. Now you have another series of steps that are going from the mizbeach to the entrance of the ulam, which is the antechamber to bring you into the heichal. That there are also 12 steps. And those 12 steps in the space of that 22 ammas between the mizbeach and the ulam, there are also these 12 steps which are half an amma wide, half an amma height. So you're going to add another 6 ammas to the 13.5 ammas of height. So you're up to 19.5. So at the most, you've got a half an amma of view if you're looking through the doorway of the temple entrance. Okay? So if you're on the Har HaZeisim, you're trying to look through the doorway of the temple entrance, the most of the view that you'll be able to see to the entrance of the Heichal is just a half an amma view. Utanan. Now, it gets even worse, because Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Ma'ila Haisa Sham, the Gavoa Amma, there was an additional step that was 1 amma high, V'ducha Nasin Olav, and there was a platform on top of that step, Ubo Shalosh Malo Shel Chatzi Amma. and it had 3 steps of a half of an amma. There's a machlokas here between Rashi and the Tosfos Yishanim whether the total height was 2.5 ammas or 1.5 amma. It doesn't matter. You're definitely over 20. So that your view looking from the doorway of the temple is now completely obstructed according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. There's no way that you can see the entrance of the Heichal, anything into the Heichal from the doorway. So Iyamart Bishlam Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov hi hainu de ichsi le pischa. Ela Iyamart Rabbanon hi ha'ika palgadams de mischas le pischa begavei. So the Gemara now says like this. According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, it's very logical as to why the Kohen had to be able to look over the wall of the eastern entrance, because to look through the doorway, it's completely obstructed. But according to the Chachamim, there's no need to say that the wall was low so that the Kohen on Har HaZeisim could look over it, because if he could position himself in such a way, there was still a half of an amma space that he could look through the doorway and see the entrance of the Heichal. So according to the Chachamim, there's no need to say that the eastern wall was lower than all of the other walls. So therefore, this proves El Shmamina, Elalav Shmamina, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakovi. This proves that the author of Maseches Midos, which requires that the eastern wall was lower, must be according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who says that otherwise there would be a complete obstruction of one's view. Okay, that's the proof that the Gemara is trying to bring from this whole discussion.
Don't come to 21 amma?
Well, according to the Chachamim, you don't have that additional platform.
That 1.5.
That 1.5 or 2.5.
So you're okay at 19.
So you're okay at 19.5. You'll have that extra half amma that you can look through the doorway. As long as you position yourself not too high, not too low, you'll be able to see through and catch a view of the Heichal, okay, of the Heichal entrance.
There's only one spot you can do it on Har HaZeisim according to Raizel, but according to Rabbanim, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you get a lot more space to do it.
Right, but according to you're right. According to Eliezer ben Yaakov, you wouldn't be confined to that one specific spot because you'd have more latitude. Yeah. Okay. Now, Rav Ada bar Ahava says, I disagree with that proof. You're not obligated to say that the author of Maseches Midos is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov just based on the power of this one proof. Because I could argue that it goes according to the Chachamim, who say that there was not that platform, that additional platform above the 19.5 ammas. But the reason why the eastern wall still had to be low is because there was something else obstructing the view. It goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer HaMizbeach Memutza Va'omid Be'emtza Azara. It goes according to Rabbi Yehuda. He says, so let's say, according to the Chachamim, that there was that extra half amma, right, that you could see. But there was something else obstructing your view, the Mizbeach. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Mizbeach is positioned exactly in the center, from a north to south perspective, exactly in the center of the courtyard, completely obstructing the view. Now, how tall was the Mizbeach? Well, without taking into account the horns, the protruding corners of the Mizbeach, it was 9 amos high. So at that point of the Mizbeach, remember we said it was 13 and a half amos of elevation from the entrance of the eastern entrance, 13 and a half amos of elevation, plus the 9 amos of the Mizbeach, you're well above 20. So that's the reason why, even if you go like like the Chachamim, and not like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, there was another factor that obstructed your view, which was the Mizbeach itself. Because why? Because Maseches Midos goes like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the Mizbeach was exactly in front of the entrance of the Heichal. It was mamish right in the center. And because let's go through the math. It says Ushloshim Ushtayim Amos Hayulo. The Mizbeach itself, at its base, was a width. It was squared with a width of 32 amos on each side. Now, Eser amos keneged pischo shel Heichal. The Heichal itself was 10 amos wide, and it was flanked by its wall space. There were chambers on either side of it. And Yud Aleph Amma Litzafon, V'Yud Aleph Amma Lidarim. So therefore, the middle 10 amos of the Mizbeach width, out of the 32, was exactly in front of the Heichal entrance, okay? And then you have another 22 amos out of the 32, 11 on the north and 11 on the south. Nimsa Mizbeach Mechuven Kenekad Heichal B'Kos Alav. So that's the thing that is obstructing the view. This is why Rav Ada bar Ahava wants to argue that you cannot prove from the power of this last Mishnah that Maseches Midos' author is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now the Gemara is challenging now Rav Ada bar Ahava. How can you possibly say that Maseches Midos goes like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the Mizbeach was mamish in the was centered to obstruct the entire view of the Heichal entrance? V'isal gadaitach midos Rabbi Yehudahi mizbeach beemtza azara mimishkachas. How could you possibly say that Maseches Midos holds that the mizbeach was centered to obstruct the view of the heichal? I'm now going to bring you another Mishnah in Maseches Midos that demonstrates that it was not obstructing the view of the heichal because it was not positioned in the center. Here, let me show you. The Hatnan. Look at the following Mishnah. Kol ha'azara haisa orech meya ushmonim v'sheva al rochav meya v'shloshim v'chamesh. That the entire courtyard was, now here we're talking about the inner courtyard, because remember, we learned about the Ezras Nashim already. Ezras Nashim is a perfect square that's 135 by 135. Now we're talking about the inner courtyard where the Mizbeach and the Heichal are located. There, it's a rectangle that's 187 amos long, going from east to west, and it's 135 amos wide, going from south to north. So the Gemara now explains, the Mishnah rather explains the measurements. Min ha-mizrach l'mayrav meya u'shmonim v'sheva, from east to west, let's go through the measurements. It's 187 amos long. Makom drisus ragli Yisrael yud alaf ama. You walk through the Sha'ar Nikanor, which is the gate that you get into the Ezras Yisrael, and the first 11 amos is called the Ezras Yisrael. It's a place where even non-Kohanim are allowed to stand. Okay? So that's 11 out of the 187. Makom drisus ragli Kohanim yud alaf ama. The next 11 amos is reserved exclusively for Kohanim in front of the Mizbeach. Only Kohanim are allowed to stand there. Now we're up to 22 amos out of the 187. Mizbeach shloshim ushtayim. Then we have the Mizbeach itself, which is 32 amos at its base. So it's 22 plus 32, 54. Okay? Bein ha'ulam v'la Mizbeach esrim ushtayim. Between the Mizbeach and the ulam, which is the antechamber entrance, so you have now 22 amos. So 54 plus 22 is how much? 76. Great. Ha-heichal kufama. So the heichal itself, the entire structure, is 100 amos long. So now you're up to 76 plus 100 is 176. The yud alaf ama achore beis hakapores, and then you have 11 amos behind the structure of the heichal to get to the back western wall of the temple, and that's a total of now 187. Great, wonderful. That's not where we're bringing our proof from. Min hadoram litzafon meya ushloshim v'chamesh. Now let's go from south to north. We said that the dimensions are a width of 135 amos. Hakevesh v'hamizbeach shishim ushtayim. So you start with the ramp. The ramp is all the way in the south, and the ramp and the mizbeach together is a total of 62 amos. Okay? Now, min hamizbeach v'latabaos ches amos. There's a floor space of 8 amos between the northern side of the Mizbeach and something called the Tabaos. The Tabaos were iron rings that were embedded in the ground that went up from the ground, and you would use those to position the head of the animal that you were being slaughtered, because the Torah says V'shachatos al yirach Mizbeach tzafona, that for many karbanos like the Ola and the Chatos, you had to slaughter it in the north side, so this was considered part of the north. Okay, so you're now up to 62 plus the 8 is you're up to 70, and makom hatabos esrim ve'arba, and that the area of these tabaos was a total of 24 going from south to north. So 70 plus 24, we're up to 94. Okay, min hatabos la shulchanos arba. Then you have floor space of another 4 amos between the rings and the marble tables, which would help you dismember the animals, that to bring it up to the mizbeach and to bring it to give the rest to the owner. So that's you're up to 98. And minat shulchanos lenanosin arba, from so one second. So Makom Atabos Esrim Va'arba Min Atabos Lo Shulchanos Arba Min Shulchanos Lo Nanosim Arba. The only part that's missing is that the place of the Shulchanos was also Arba, which is what Rashi fills in for us. The place of the Shulchanos was another 4. So now you're up to 102. Then you have floor space from the Shulchanos to the Nanosim. The Nanosim are these pillars that had hooks at the end of them to help you flay the hide of the animal off of the animal. So that was Arba. That was also 4. So you're up to 102 plus 4 is 106. Min Nanosim lekoisel azaraches amos. And then from 106 to the wall, you're now another 8, so you're up to 114. So where do we get the 135?
Where's the dimension of the Nasim? Don't they have some space?
One second. So you have 114, and you got to get to 135. So there's a deficit of 21. Okay, so the hamos are ben hakevesh lelakos l'mokam hananasim, right? So the extra 21 amos was divided between the area of the nanasim. Those hooks were 10.5 amos, and the area from the southern wall to the ramp was also 10.5 amos. That's how you get to the 135. Now just think about it for a second. When we talk about the space of, you have 10.5 amos from the southern wall until you get to the ramp. The ramp plus the mizbeach is 62. So at the most, the ramp is the northern side of the mizbeach, according to Maseches Midos, is 62 plus 10 is 72.5. It's going to get to 72.5 amos. Now, if you 72.5 amos minus, take that away from 135, what do you get?
60, 80,
The point is, it's a little bit more than half, but you still have a view of that 10 amos aperture of the Heichal, because the Mizbeach, according to this measurement, is not completely obstructing the entrance to the Heichal. It's only partially on the southern side, is a partial obstruction to the Heichal. So the Gemara's argument is, and certainly the Mizbeach is not perfectly centered in front of the Heichal according to these measurements, according to these dimensions. And if that's the case, you can't say that our Mishnah in Maseches Midos goes according to Rebbe Yehuda. So the Isal Gedaitach Midos Rebbe Yehuda hi Mizbeach be'emtza azara mimishkachas lei haruba de Mizbeach bedaram kai. It turns out that the majority of the Mizbeach is in the south. And it's not, therefore it's clear that the author of Maseches Midos cannot be Rebbe Yehuda, who says that the Mizbeach is perfectly centered. It turns out that using the Mizbeach itself cannot alone account for the obstruction of the view of the Heichal if you're coming from the eastern side. And therefore the only alternative is that there is a vertical obstruction of the entrance of the Heichal from the eastern side, which is why the eastern wall had to be lower, and therefore Elalav Shmamino Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov he Shmamino. We therefore must conclude that the author of Maseches Midos, there's no one else. It can't be Rebbe Yehuda. It therefore must be Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov QED. That proves that the author of Maseches Midos is none other than Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov. And we will hold it here for today.